Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Institute for the Advancement of Food and Nutrition Sciences for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all today. I'm happy to be here this afternoon on behalf of the National Salt and Sugar Reduction Initiative, or NSSRI, an initiative convened by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Some of you may be familiar with this initiative. You may have partnered with us to reduce salt in the food supply, or have shared your thoughts with us on our sugar reduction efforts, or maybe you attended a webinar on the sugar reduction targets that we released earlier this year, while others may be brand new to the NSSRI framework. I'm delighted to be here to continue to talk about our work on sodium and sugar reduction and to invite you to join us in creating a healthier food supply. Here's an overview of what I plan to discuss with you today. First, I'll talk about our efforts on sodium reduction targets, followed by our work on sugar reduction targets, and finally, next steps, which includes opportunities for the food and beverage industry. So let's dive into the work we've done on sodium. The NSSRI initially started as the National Salt Reduction Initiative, the NSRI for short. At this point in time, we were focused only on sodium reduction. Looking at this graphic on the right, we can see the top sources of sodium in the diet. The bigger the circle, the more this food group contributes to sodium in the diet. At the beginning of the NSRI, we considered the top sources of sodium and realized that because sodium comes from so many sources, there's great opportunity for industry to make small changes across a variety of categories that could have an enormous impact. The initiative started in 2009 and was modeled off an initiative from the United Kingdom. The New York City Health Department launched the initiative and convened a partnership of organizations from across the country. The goal was to ask industry to voluntarily commit to sodium reduction. We set sodium reduction targets for 62 packaged food and 25 restaurant categories for 2012 and 2014. Through the NSRI National Partnership, organizations came together to make one joint ask of industry, and this partnership still thrives as the NSSRI today and has grown to over 100 organizations. Our partners are city and state health authorities, health organizations, and associations from across the country, some of whom are here at the showcase and participating in this session with me, like the American Heart Association and the Center for Science and the Public Interest. The goal of the NSRI was to reduce sodium in packaged and restaurant foods as a way to reduce sodium intake and ultimately reduce risk of heart disease and stroke. Receiving and considering industry feedback, we set sodium targets for packaged food categories and restaurant categories. 28 companies ended up committing to reduce sodium as part of the NSRI, and we analyzed changes in the food supply over time. Evaluation is an important part of all of our work, and assessing the progress of the NSRI was no exception. We tracked sodium in the food supply by updating the packaged and restaurant food databases, which we initially built in 2009. We rebuilt these databases in 2012, 2014, and again in 2018. This has allowed us to track the progress of the companies that committed and also track industry progress as a whole and by category, including for companies that did not make a public commitment. What we found was that from 2009 to 2014, sodium density declined significantly in almost half of all of our food categories. Overall, sodium density declined significantly by 6.8%. And so we think about what did we learn from the NSRI, there's 4 things I want to highlight. The first is this model works. The strength of the partnership was critical, and the voluntary target framework did in fact produce results. Next, we learned that engaging industry is critical. So I mentioned that 28 companies committed, with many more engaged in providing feedback. We even received feedback from industry that these targets were helpful as internal benchmarks, even if they were unable to make a public commitment. Next, we learned that innovation is possible. Industry demonstrated that innovation is feasible within a relatively short amount of time. We recognize that we're the public health experts, but that industry has the reformulation expertise, and we saw some great examples of product reformulation that contributed to reductions in sodium. And last, we learned that more action is still needed on salt. So we made some progress, but more still needs to be done. Sodium consumption is still far too high. As we saw on the prior slide, the average daily consumption is nearly 3,400 milligrams per day versus the recommended limit of 2,300 milligrams. So here's a timeline of what has occurred since our NSRI sodium targets ended in 2014. In 2016, the FDA released draft sodium guidance to encourage reduction in sodium in the food supply and collected feedback via a public comment period. In 2018, we rebuilt the NSRI packaged food database, which was a refresh of the database that we had previously rebuilt in 2009, 2012, and 2014 to continue to assess changes in the food supply. As you can imagine, much of this work was paused during the COVID-19 public health emergency. But then in October of 2021, just a few weeks ago, the FDA released their long-awaited sodium guidance. These are revisions of the targets and categories that they had initially released in 2016. I mentioned previously that we observed a 6.8% reduction in sodium in packaged foods from 2009 to 2014. When we rebuilt our database in 2018, we performed an analysis to assess the extent to which reductions in sodium occurring during the NSRI continued after 2014. And what we found was that the rate of sodium reduction in the packaged food supply slowed after initial reformulation, and the larger decline that occurred during the first part of the NSRI was not sustained following the end of the NSRI. So we can see the results here on this table. In this chart, among products in the top 80% of sales in all years, sodium declined 5.5% from 2009 to 2012, and an additional 1.5% from 2012 to 2014 due to reformulation, with no further changes occurring after 2014. Products that were new to the marketplace after 2009 showed no decline in sodium density after 2012. Given these findings, we're thrilled to see that in October, the FDA released the final sodium guidance, setting targets for the next 2.5 years. The companies that work towards sodium reduction as part of the NSRI are likely best positioned to meet the FDA guidance. And we look forward to seeing how industry innovates and work toward these targets, how the FDA monitors progress, and for any additional targets that the FDA sets in subsequent years. So now let's move on to some of our work in sugar reduction. This is the same timeline we saw a few slides back with our work on sodium reduction. After the FDA released their draft guidance on sodium in 2016, we expanded the National Salt Reduction Initiative to become the National Salt and Sugar Reduction Initiative in 2018 to focus on sugar in the food supply. And you can see that added here to this visual. So we spent the following 2 years with the pause for New York City's COVID-19 response, working on developing sugar reduction targets, which included gathering feedback from industry. We were finally able to release sugar reduction targets in February of 2021. And so you can see how this work stream of sugar fits into the timeline here. Because of some similarities between sodium and sugar in the food supply, we were able to follow a very similar strategy for our sugar reduction targets, which I'll now cover in a bit more detail. So just like our past work on sodium, most of the sugar that Americans eat and drink comes from packaged and prepared foods, not from the sugar added while cooking or baking. In fact, 68% of packaged foods and beverages purchased in the US contain a caloric sweetener. We also know that adults and children consume more added sugars than recommended, and that intake of added sugars is associated with negative health outcomes. The graphic on the right shows us the average intake of added sugars is 266 calories per day, compared to the recommended limit of 200 calories, and this recommendation is for a 2,000 calorie diet. It shows the different sources of added sugar in the diet. We see a range of processed foods contributing sugar to the diet, such as beverages, snacks, sweets, and there's also some other unexpected sources, like salad dressing and barbecue sauce. Like we saw with sodium, sugar is ubiquitous in our food supply, and small changes across a variety of food categories can have a large impact. In thinking about the framework we developed and the partnership we built, we realized that we could use the same structure to expand our focus to include added sugars, which has become increasingly important to consumers. As you all know, consumers are paying attention to their added sugar intake, and this will likely continue to be the case now that added sugars are broken out on the nutrition facts label. This creates an opportunity for industry and emphasizes the significant role that industry has in shaping diets. We're seeing recognition of the problem and interest from some key members of industry, And the NSSRI implements a framework that can accelerate this work and encourage the involvement of companies across the board, not just by a few key players. Just like with sodium, the first step in setting the targets was to build a packaged food and beverage database. We did this by merging Nielsen sales data and Label Insight nutrition data linked by UPC. We included the top selling products in each category, so the top 80% of sales, and then we calculated the mean for each category weighted by sales. We do this so that the products that are purchased and consumed more often factor more heavily into the average across each category. We calculated a baseline for each category, and then targets are set as a reduction from this baseline. We released draft categories and targets, which kicked off a 2-year process to refine them. We did this by soliciting feedback from industry via a series of meetings and by collecting written comments. And in the end, we landed on 15 categories of foods and beverages, which we'll take a look at shortly. These categories represent about 60% of sugar intake in the diet. So as mentioned previously, our final voluntary targets were released in February of 2021. The metric for these targets is sugar density. So this means that we're looking at grams of sugar per 100 grams of product or per 100 milliliters for beverages. It's worth pointing out that changing package or portion size does not impact density, since what we're looking for here is really a ratio of sugar to the amount of product. The targets apply to a company's overall sales weighted mean within a category. They're interim 2023 targets and 2026 targets. For most categories, targets are set to be a 10% reduction by 2023 and a 20% reduction by 2026, with the exception of sugary drinks, in which we're asking for a 40% reduction. These are reductions from the baseline sales weighted mean, which use sales data merged with Label Insight nutrition data, as I mentioned earlier. And then we plan to assess progress in 2023 and 2026. So here are the categories that are included in this initiative. We have 7 meta categories, which include drinks, grain-based desserts and snack bars, refrigerated and frozen desserts, candies, breakfast cereals, condiments and toppings, and yogurt, and then a total of 15 subcategories. This next slide illustrates how the sales weighted mean target works using data from a sample category. In this chart, you can see that sugar density is along the x-axis and the percent market share at each level of sugar density is on the y-axis. The blue bars represent a distribution of sugar density for this category. And you can see here that the current sales weighted mean is where that gray line sits at 27.1 grams of sugar per 100 grams of food. The 2023 target, which is a 10% reduction represented by that dashed red line, is 24.4 grams. And the 2026 target, a 20% reduction, that solid red line, is 21.7 grams. You can also see from the distribution looking at the blue bars that the product with the lowest sugar density in this category falls within 0 to 2 grams, and the highest falls within 44 to 46 grams. So this is the range for this particular category. If industry responds by meeting the target for their products, the overall distribution of this category shifts to the left, decreasing sugar density across the whole category. As a result, the sales weighted mean for the category will shift to the left as well. And this doesn't mean that every product has to fall below the sales weighted mean. Some can be below and some can be above, but what we're looking to do is to shift the mean of the category. Companies can meet the targets by calculating the mean sugar density of all of their products in a category, taking sales into account. Within this model, there are multiple ways that a company could go about meeting the target in a particular category. First, they could reformulate to lower sugar in their products. Second, they could remove sugar-dense products from the market. Third, they could introduce newer, lower sugar products. Or 4 is through marketing, where no reformulation is done at all, but instead, a company could work to shift their portfolio of sales via marketing to influence the sales weighted mean. As you can see, this provides companies with flexibility, which is why we landed on a sales weighted mean target as the central part of this framework. One note on the reformulation strategy that I just mentioned, particularly around low and no calorie sweeteners. Targets were drafted with the expectation that companies will meet the proposed targets without increasing saturated fat, calories, sodium, or refined carbohydrates as part of the reformulation to reduce sugar. In terms of low and no calorie sweeteners, we advise companies to consider existing and new scientific research and regulations to determine the appropriate use of low and no calorie sweeteners in their products. And we recommend avoiding the use of these sweeteners in products that are marketed to or commonly consumed by children. So in terms of next steps, there's an opportunity for companies to publicly commit to meeting these targets. Companies can commit to 2023 and or 2026 targets for a particular category or multiple categories. We plan to raise awareness around commitments and the potential impact of the initiative. We've seen in the past that this initiative can draw a lot of attention and has been well received. So you can see a sample of those headlines here, from our initial sodium reduction targets to the announcement of our sugar reduction work and the results of a modeling study that estimated the cost effectiveness savings of the initiative. A big part of this initiative is evaluation. So the NSSRI database that we built to set targets will be updated and used to monitor progress against the targets over time. We'll be tracking progress on the overall food supply and at the category level, and we can also track progress at the manufacturer level. We're really excited to share these targets publicly as guideposts to be used by the public health community, academics, and advocates, and to be used by industry, even if a public commitment is not possible. So thank you for your time. I'm really happy to be here today and to answer any questions you may have, either now or as part of our Q&A or offline. You can reach out to me at any time at the email address you see on your screen, and the NSSRI team and I hope that we can hear from you soon.
Good afternoon, and thanks Wendelin and the IFINS Program Planning Committee for the invitation to join you all today and share a bit about the American Heart Association's perspectives on innovation for better health and health equity through food. I'm an employee of the American Heart Association, and I don't have any other conflicts to disclose. Our mission at the American Heart Association is to be a relentless force for a world of longer, healthier lives. And when we say world, we mean all people. So our 2024 impact goal states that as champions for health equity by 2024, the American Heart Association will advance cardiovascular health for all, identify and remove barriers, many of which include the social determinants of health, including structural racism. So why do we do this? Heart disease remains the #1 cause of death in the US and around the world. 126.9 million individuals in the US have some form of cardiovascular disease, and 18.6 million around the world die from cardiovascular disease every year. COVID-19 is both worsened by and worsens cardiovascular disease, and it also increases disparities in health and food security, which are certainly related to cardiovascular disease. It doesn't take long to start to see the disparities in cardiovascular disease when you look at age-adjusted mortality rates. While white adults in the US have a greater prevalence of cardiovascular disease, 32% of Black adults are more likely to die from cardiovascular disease. And while deaths from cardiovascular disease have been declining across all races and ethnicities, we don't see the reduction in death rates in across races and ethnicities keeping up with the reduction that we see in white Americans, especially for Native American and Alaska Natives. Similarly with stroke, we see that Black adults are 45% more likely to die from stroke compared to white adults. And again, the declines in other races and ethnicities, particularly Hispanic, Latino, and Native American and Alaska Native populations, those declines are lagging behind the declines that we see in white populations. Are not surprising when you consider the fact that 80 to 90% of a person's risk is related to social determinants of health. And while there are many different determinants, diet is certainly one of them. So I would suggest that as you think about innovation, First and foremost, take a moment to think about the individuals who are living in historically marginalized communities and the challenges that they're facing from day to day. And just give a moment to consider how your innovation, whether it be a product, a distribution method, a marketing strategy, or retail strategy, think about the impact that that work will have on these individuals so that we can start to really chip away at these disparities. Now I'd like to share with you the 2021 dietary guidance to improve cardiovascular health that was released by the American Heart Association earlier this year. It's authored by Dr. Alice Lichtenstein and other members of the Nutrition Committee. First of all, what's new? There is a focus in this particular dietary guidance release on the overall dietary pattern, ensuring that we are mindful of providing flexibility for folks, for individuals, and for communities to really honor their preferences and traditions. Secondly, there's a recognition that the food environment, as we've discussed already, does present barriers to adoption and really creates a public health imperative. And then finally, there's a recognition of the interconnectedness of what is good for people and planet. This area of research has really advanced to a level that the writing group felt it was important to call it out. What has not changed in these recommendations is the types of nutrients and foods that we recommend for increased cardiovascular health. There are some nuances, some shifts, but not an overhaul. So first of all, the importance of adjusting energy in and energy out to achieve and maintain a healthy weight remains very important. Easier said than done, certainly. And part of that is understanding that willpower is not enough when individuals are bombarded with cues to eat throughout their day, whether in an office space or working from home next to the kitchen these days, or watching television or experiencing other forms of advertising in the places that they go. So thinking about that food environment is very important in helping people to really move towards healthier patterns and healthier levels of consumption in terms of calories. We also see that people who are experiencing food insecurity have increased stress, which we know hampers decision-making ability. I personally have experienced this during the pandemic, and I suspect many of you have as well. But we also know that they have an increased risk of chronic diet-related diseases, including cardiovascular disease. And that's because they have a tendency with limited options, with having to make trade-offs because of the cost of food or the availability of food in their immediate environment. Those trade-offs lead to a diet that's typically nutrient poor and calorie rich. So that is exactly the opposite of what we want to encourage people to be consuming, and really speaks to the importance of energy balance, not only for people who have enough food, ample food, but for people who struggle with consistent access to healthy food. The second feature is that we encourage eating plenty of fruits and vegetables and a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. And I'll mention here that all forms of fruits and vegetables fit, with some attention to portions with particular forms like fruit juice, where it's easy to consume a large quantity without having the same level of satiety as with the whole fruit, but certainly 100% fruit and vegetable juices fit. And then also with canned and frozen varieties that can be quite nutritious, really looking for lower sodium, lower sugar varieties, if sugar or sodium is added at all. Choosing mostly whole versus refined grains continues to be a recommendation, and really no change there. And then choosing healthy sources of protein. We've provided more detail here about what we mean by that. So emphasizing plant sources of protein like legumes and nuts. And those legumes can be soybeans, other forms of beans, chickpeas, lentils, lots of variety there in those choices. Also, there's room for fish and regular consumption of fish and seafood, low fat and non-fat instead of full fat dairy. And when meat or poultry are consumed, to choose fresh and unprocessed versions to avoid the added salt that's often present in those processed meat products. And then finally on this slide is the recommendation to choose liquid, non-tropical plant oils. And so in the past, we've talked about vegetable oils or we've just talked about liquid. The reality is that the tropical oils like coconut, palm, and palm kernel that have become increasingly popular as people have shifted to plant-based diets, as the industry has looked to remove partially hydrogenated vegetable oils from foods, do contribute a significant amount of saturated fat to the diet. And so really we're looking to reduce saturated fat from all sources, including these tropical fats, I would say. The liquid plant oils that are really to be encouraged are any of the other plant oils that are not tropical. So whether it's canola, olive, soybean, corn, safflower, sunflower, the high oleic versions of those oils, and then oils that either are derived from or occur naturally in nuts and flaxseed and other seeds. The next feature highlighted is actually new for American Heart Association's dietary guidance, which is to choose minimally processed foods. There are a lot of questions to be worked out through research around the role of processing in either promoting or detracting from cardiovascular health. For now, I think it's important for food innovators to think about the end product that you're innovating towards. Is the processing step improving safety, retaining the maximum amount of nutrition that was originally present in the food, or even enhancing it? And is the innovation adding unnecessary salt, added sugars, or saturated fat to the mix that can actually detract from cardiovascular health? So it's really about thinking about health as a driver in processing decisions. Minimizing intake of added sugars, of course, remains very important, and we've seen a lot of innovation in this space over the years. Certainly low energy sweeteners have played a role in helping many individuals to reduce the amount of sugar that they consume. It may be that we're in a place in society today where there's an opportunity to reduce the overall sweetness of certain foods and beverages. And we've seen some real popularity around beverages, carbonated beverages that are sweetened with a very small amount of fruit juice or a small amount of flavor that's less sweet and maybe a bit more complex than just adding sugar. And so those kinds of things are really exciting because they're really bringing a different way of experiencing food and beverages to the American palate. Similarly, with salt reduction, the next feature of a healthy dietary pattern is some really interesting innovation around not just reducing salt and sodium, which has been incredibly important, but also introducing, again, more complex flavor profiles using herbs, spices, umami ingredients. Potassium chloride has certainly played a role, although with its bitter profile, it does have some limitations. And I think that's the take-home message for all of the sodium reduction technologies that we're aware of, is that there is no one-size-fits-all. So it's exciting to see so much innovation, and I know that this has been a very strong priority for the food industry for many years. Now that the FDA has released its voluntary guidance for the reduction of sodium in the food supply in not only packaged foods but also restaurant foods, there's a renewed opportunity to take that sodium reduction to the next level and to bring more food producers and more restaurants on board with that effort. The next is not really relevant for our conversation today, but I do want to mention that if you don't drink alcohol, the recommendation is that you don't start. There is no health benefit to drinking alcohol. And if you do choose to drink, really limit consumption. The 10th feature of a healthy dietary pattern is the last one that I'll cover. And it really is to think about these guidance features wherever food is consumed, whether you are preparing food in the home, ordering from a menu, or shopping in the grocery store, really utilizing these features as a guide and making healthier food choices. And for the industry, as you innovate, to think about all of these features, whether you're preparing foods to be packaged and sold in grocery stores, prepared and to be sold in a grocery store or restaurant or other setting, or in how food is marketed. Next, I'd like to share with you a scientific advisory from the American Heart Association that was published in 2019 on innovation to create a healthy and sustainable food system. It was authored by Cheryl Anderson and other members of the Nutrition Committee, and really took a look at what are some of the broad considerations of the full system that can be more supportive of health and sustainability. Three key points that came out in this paper were that a healthy and sustainable food system really promotes and maintains nutrient-dense dietary patterns. Secondly, it meets the needs of the current population without compromising the needs of future generations. And it truly requires multi-level, multi-sector, multi-system innovative approaches, not only in the foods that are produced, but how they're marketed, how they're made available and accessible to people and communities throughout the country and the world. So some innovation thought starters as we kind of move through those couple of papers as the foundation here is to start with the product, but keep going. So when you're looking at food product innovation, the nutrients and the food groups that we talked about, more fruit, more vegetable, more whole grain, more plant proteins, but also less sodium, added sugars, and saturated fat are going to be important in how you innovate for better nutrition. Smaller portions remains something that can be helpful to some individuals. Really what, again, thinking about the total food environment and the excessive cues to eat all of the time, I think that is a reality that even with smaller portions can be a challenge. But regardless, indulgent foods packaged in smaller portions can be helpful to some people in controlling their intake or at least becoming more mindful of their intake. I've mentioned the idea of marketing and advertising and just want to reiterate that health promoting marketing and advertising is really critical, including how foods are priced, specials that are run, discounts that are given, and a newer area that really has become more evident during the pandemic with the increased uptake of online shopping is a look at the algorithms that are used in artificial intelligence to really guide decision making. So if a person buys unhealthy foods, they can be continually encouraged to keep buying the same kinds of foods. Are there ways that those algorithms could be adjusted in order to really prompt healthier choices, or even to give people an opportunity to control their settings so that they are made aware of healthier choices within their shopping experience? Just some ideas to think about on the technology front. And then, in restaurants, really healthy default choices for kids' meals, but also beyond restaurants and food products that are marketed as meals for kids, really looking at improving the nutritional profile of those foods so that we can really help the younger generations to understand what it means to eat healthfully and flavorfully. And I say that really has to lead in marketing and advertising and food production and packaging, is that when a product is produced to be more healthy, it isn't always going to help to market it as, hey, here's the healthiest food for your kid. We know that's going to resonate with moms and certain segments of the population, but let's face it, we all want our food to taste good. So really marketing healthy foods as flavorful and fun, I think, is an opportunity. These types of innovations are an important component in empowering consumers along their entire food journey, from preparation or planning to shopping, preparing food in the home, and eating. We have the Heart Check certification program that's utilized in stores by consumers to really see products, easily identify products that have been vetted and found to have properties that help to promote cardiovascular health. We also advocate for dietitian access, not only in healthcare, but also in the food system where people are making food decisions, in grocery stores and in the development of restaurant menus. But what about folks who don't have access to a dietitian or much less a grocery store? How can we help to serve those consumers and improve the access and availability of healthy foods so that they can build healthier diets? Think about grocery store access, especially if you are a food retailer. Think about whether you are taking SNAP, EBT, and WIC making available WIC approved foods. There's an opportunity in all sectors of the food system to provide support and mentorship to local food systems and companies, which can help us to really respond more effectively to different cultural practices within a community and really understand what that community has identified as their own needs. Really making healthier food donations to food banks, forging connections between healthcare community and food systems. There may be really unique roles for different players in the food system to do that. And then, as I mentioned, health promoting, marketing, and advertising. So my closing thoughts, I encourage you to weave equity throughout the decision-making process. Look to AHA's scientific statements and heart check certification criteria to really understand what our perspective is on nutritional innovations that would be valuable. And expand your thinking beyond product innovation to ensure equitable access. Market products with health as a priority, emphasizing overall healthy dietary patterns, but as much as possible leading with food, flavor, and fun, because that's what people really want in their healthy foods. Partner with dietitians and healthcare and community systems to forge those linkages that can really connect those in need with healthy diets. And finally, partner within the food system to address the barriers to health, equity, and sustainability. With that, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to the discussion.